Look at the projection of absolute American power. Right now, 3 United States aircraft carriers and a formidable naval blockade are suffocating the Iranian coastline. It is a multi-trillion-dollar armada engineered to project undeniable deterrence. On paper, this is total dominance. But step outside the Pentagon's theoretical models, and the illusion shatters. The brutal reality is written in the global markets. The Strait of Hormuz remains entirely shut. The lifeblood of the industrial world is strangled, with oil paralyzed at an agonizing $110 per barrel. Washington has deployed its ultimate military hand, yet Washington is completely trapped. The machinery of American leverage has been neutralized without a single missile being fired. How? Because while the United States Navy anchors itself in the Gulf, Iran's foreign minister quietly boarded a flight to St. Petersburg. That single diplomatic maneuver just rendered the most powerful fleet in human history strategically irrelevant. We map the hidden machinery of global conflict. To understand the brutal strategic realities shaping the world before the mainstream media catches up, subscribe to the channel right now. Let us map the geography of a trap. Over the course of 72 hours, Iran's diplomatic apparatus executed a masterclass in strategic sequencing. From the mediation corridors of Islamabad to the geographic fulcrum of Muscat, culminating in the halls of St. Petersburg, this was not a desperate plea for de-escalation. It was the synchronized assembly of an economic guillotine. The sequence is deliberate, and the objective is absolute. While seated across from Vladimir Putin, Tehran delivered its ultimatum to Washington, a brilliantly lethal 2-track peace proposal that fundamentally alters the balance of power in the Middle East. On the surface, the proposal masquerades as a reasonable diplomatic off-ramp. Track 1 offers immediate relief. Iran agrees to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, allowing the paralyzed global energy market to finally breathe, provided the United States completely dismantles its suffocating naval blockade. Track 2 dictates that the core issue, Iran's accelerating nuclear infrastructure, is explicitly decoupled from the maritime crisis, postponed indefinitely to a vague future timeline with 0 preconditions and 0 concrete deadlines. To the untrained eye, this looks like a necessary compromise. To a geopolitical strategist, it is an irreversible capitulation. Look closely at the brutal asymmetry of leverage. The United States has already exhausted its kinetic options. The bombs have dropped. The military campaign is paused. That multi-trillion-dollar naval blockade, alongside the looming threat of resumed hostilities, is the absolute last mechanism of coercive pressure Washington possesses to prevent the realization of a nuclear-armed Tehran. Iran is not asking America to negotiate an end to the war. Iran is demanding that America unilaterally disarm its final strategic weapon just to restore the global economic status quo. If the White House accepts this deal to relieve the crushing domestic political weight of $110 oil, they do not merely lose the current standoff. They permanently surrender the nuclear file. The leverage evaporates. The strategic cage is locked. By divorcing the geographic blockade from the nuclear question, Iran secures an undisputed victory. They keep their atomic infrastructure intact. They force a superpower to retreat from their coastline, and they establish a terrifying new precedent: the undisputed capability to hold the global economy hostage whenever Washington steps out of line. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps explicitly broadcasted this reality, declaring their shadow over Hormuz a definitive strategy rather than a temporary negotiating tactic. Washington is currently staring at a terminal strategic failure, fully aware that rejecting the proposal means absorbing compounding, perhaps insurmountable, economic devastation at home. But the sheer brilliance of Tehran's maneuver does not end with a piece of paper delivered in Moscow. To permanently cement this victory, Iran needs to fundamentally rewrite the architecture of international maritime law. They need to transform an open international waterway into a controlled toll booth. And to accomplish that unprecedented legal fracture, they require the quiet, terrified complicity of a single neighboring state. To understand why Washington is rapidly losing its grip on the Middle East, you have to look at a map. The Strait of Hormuz is not a vast, uncontrollable ocean. At its absolute narrowest point, it is a 21-mile bottleneck. On the northern shore sits the Iranian military apparatus, and on the southern shore lies the Musandam Peninsula, sovereign territory of the Sultanate of Oman. This geography dictates the brutal reality of international shipping. Any vessel transiting this artery must physically pass through the territorial waters of either Iran or Oman. For decades, the global economy has relied on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, treating this exact corridor as an unrestricted international transit passage. Before the war, up to 160 ships moved through daily, carrying 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas with zero tolls and zero Iranian approval required. That era is over. Iranian officials have explicitly declared that the strait will under no circumstances return to its previous state. But Tehran cannot unilaterally rewrite international maritime law without triggering a global coalition against it. It needs a sovereign partner to legitimize the fracture. It needs Oman. Oman is terrified. Muscat does not want the strait militarized, nor does it want its pristine territorial waters transformed into a great power battlefield. But Oman also shares a maritime border with an increasingly aggressive neighbor that could systematically dismantle the Omani economy and target its ports if relations sour. During the recent diplomatic offensive, the Iranian foreign minister bypassed Western capitals and flew directly to Muscat, sitting down with Sultan Haitham bin Tariq and the Omani foreign minister. The official readout of that meeting was chillingly brief. It stated that the two nations reached agreements, plural, focused on the strait. They did not announce a return to unconditional access. They did not reaffirm international law. They signaled a transition toward managed transit. What does managed transit actually mean in the cold light of geopolitics? It means the death of open seas. If Oman capitulates to Iranian pressure and coordinates on a new regulatory architecture, potentially involving arbitrary tolls, vessel inspections, or mandatory Iranian approval mechanisms, the entire legal foundation of global shipping collapses. Because Omani territorial waters cover exactly half of that critical 21-mile passage, Muscat's compliance is the skeleton key. If Oman agrees to enforce Tehran's vision of a controlled waterway, Washington's legal justification for protecting international commerce evaporates overnight. The United States Navy would no longer be defending a universal right of transit. It would be aggressively violating the bilateral sovereign agreements of the states that own the shoreline. Washington is watching a vital regional actor crack under the geographic weight of Iranian proximity. But Tehran's masterstroke was never just about isolating Oman. To pull off a geopolitical heist of this magnitude, to hold a fifth of the world's energy supply hostage without triggering a direct American military strike, Iran required an insurance policy. They needed a nuclear superpower to stand in front of them and dare the United States to pull the trigger. And as the ink dried on the Omani agreements, Vladimir Putin was already waiting in St. Petersburg. The fracture of Omani territorial waters provides the legal mechanism for Iran's dominance, but the survival of the regime itself requires a much larger geopolitical shield. To execute a standoff of this magnitude, Tehran needed the explicit backing of an alternative global architecture. They found it in the perfectly complementary strategies of Moscow and Beijing. This is where the illusion of a contained bilateral conflict entirely collapses. Vladimir Putin is acting as the geopolitical lightning rod. By publicly embracing the Iranian foreign minister in St. Petersburg and explicitly pledging that Russia will do everything to serve Iran's interests, Putin has crossed a terminal threshold. He is not mediating, he is allying. This maneuver is a calculated strike to break Russia's post-Ukraine isolation and shatter the American monopoly on Middle Eastern diplomacy. Furthermore, Russia possesses raw leverage that the United States fundamentally lacks. Moscow sells advanced weaponry to nations across the region and maintains transactional military relationships with Gulf states that Washington cannot control. Russia operates without the constraints of democratic norms or rigid alliance structures, allowing Putin to pressure regional actors in ways that paralyze American diplomats. By positioning the Russian defense apparatus to guarantee Iranian sovereignty, Moscow is establishing a red line. They are signaling to the Pentagon that any kinetic strike to break the Hormuz blockade will trigger an asymmetric Russian response across the entire theater. But while Russia absorbs the diplomatic heat and commands the headlines, Beijing is executing a far more lethal, silent strategy. China does not need to issue grand public ultimatums or fly its foreign minister to Muscat. China's support is not rhetorical, it is structural. Every single barrel of sanctioned Iranian oil purchased by Beijing is a deliberate injection of capital into the regime's survival engine. China is the entity funding the infrastructure, buying the crude, and systematically insulating Tehran from the paralyzing effects of American financial warfare. Beijing provides the absolute economic baseline that allows Iran to sustain a high-stakes siege against the United States without collapsing from within. The sheer brutality of this multipolar alignment is rooted in the asymmetry of economic pain. China is actively benefiting from the very crisis that is destroying American political capital. While Washington bleeds over a paralyzed global energy market and domestic voter rage fueled by gasoline prices, China remains remarkably insulated. Beijing has spent the last decade aggressively immunizing its energy grid, securing land-based pipelines from Russia, and developing a sprawling, diversified network of liquefied natural gas terminals. They can absorb the shock of a restricted Hormuz. The United States cannot. This is not a regional dispute over transit rights. It is a synchronized, great power proxy war where Russia provides the diplomatic shield, China provides the limitless wallet, and the American military is left patrolling an empty ocean. The American national security apparatus is currently locked in a room in the White House, staring at a terminal strategic dilemma. There is no victory condition left on the board. There is only the management of defeat. If the United States accepts this Iranian proposal, the blockade is dismantled and the global shipping lanes reopen. The immediate crisis of $110 oil subsides, but the cost is the permanent, irreversible surrender of the nuclear file. Iran retains its atomic infrastructure and successfully establishes the terrifying precedent that it can choke the global economy to force American capitulation at will. They win the geographic war. Conversely, if Washington rejects the deal to preserve its nuclear leverage, the standoff compounds. The 3 aircraft carriers remain anchored. The blockade holds. But the economic devastation accelerates. The United States will be forced to absorb an indefinite period of exorbitant energy costs, watching inflation erode its domestic stability while Russia and China quietly consolidate their dominance over the Middle East. Every day the strait remains closed is another day the American military looks fundamentally powerless to protect the arteries of global commerce. The illusion of American unipolar dominance is bleeding out in the waters of the Persian Gulf. Washington faces a terminal choice. Do they break the blockade and surrender their final piece of nuclear leverage forever? Or do they maintain the siege and watch $100 oil slowly crush the American economy from the inside? Which poison pill will the administration swallow? Lay out your strategic assessment in the comments below.